All right. So as we do, we dive right in, and I want to find out, especially from Vicky and Phil, what are some of the things that people can do, given your own work and experiences? What can attendees do, especially at the municipal and organizational levels? What do you recommend, Vicky?
Yeah, so I served on the school board in Yakima, one of the cities that is included in Abby's research for 8 years. And I think that one of the most important things that people can do at the local level is to understand what their municipalities and decision makers are working on. So local city councils, local school boards make decisions every day about allocation of resources, about programs and services to families and children. It's important that people understand what's happening and what decisions are being made. Sometimes one can access as an individual. More often, it's helpful to have organizations in communities to help individuals access information.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's important, at least for the audience, to know that in Lewiston's case, our experience with the immigrant relocations were refugees, and it wasn't a planned resettlement. So these were secondary, what are referred to in the refugee nomenclature as secondary immigrants, secondary relocations coming into the community and taking up residence as an unplanned relocation, which can put a lot of demands on resources, as you might imagine, if you're not planning for it. And without elaborating, it's just important. You've heard the theme throughout the discussion up to this point: community involvement, getting organizations locally involved at the local, state, and federal level. It's critically important, and for communities that are going through something like this for the first time, get connected either to to an agency that's in the state or a community in the state that has had some prior experience with a refugee resettlement or an immigrant relocation of some sort, and talk to them and get their experience and get their perspective on what it is that you should be doing relative to first steps. Because we could talk about what we did all day long, but if I had to just compress it into a single statement, it would be getting everyone involved across agencies and speaking to people that have had prior experience.
And for attendees not working in government or in large organizations, as a committee chairperson or as part of a nonprofit, Christina and Jason, what can they do? Where do you recommend starting?
Well, I think a lot of this work that the City of Tulsa started on was because we actually were reached out with our local YWCA Immigrant Refugee Center. And so that was a great opportunity to partner with them and to go through this process of learning about how municipal governments can be welcoming together. So that was a huge help to be able to start that process together. And I think that any individual or any smaller organization that is interested in partnering with their local municipal government might benefit from reaching out to who are the willing, and start with that. That might be somebody in the city, that might be another bigger organization. Maybe it could be the Chamber of Commerce. So find who are the willing and start with that. And I mean, I think with any of these things, similarly to what Abigail was saying, it's about building the momentum for public acceptance. And as that momentum builds and as the more diverse that group is, so you have not just people from nonprofit, education, business, as more diverse as that group is, the easier it will be to win more people, and especially, I think, your local government.
Yeah, and I would second that. I think regardless of whether you're in local government or not in local government, one of the first things to do is identifying who are the key stakeholders and influencers in a community, and then figuring out a way to get them on board. Because with anything, it's easy to ignore a small group of people or a couple of small organizations. It's really hard to ignore a diverse coalition of the schools and churches and businesses and community organizations. And at the end of the day, if you can get them sold on the benefits to the community of diversity and immigration, they're going to be able to be huge influencers, because when it's the superintendent of schools calling the mayor, that call is going to always get through, whereas it may not necessarily get through from a smaller agency the first time.
So Jason, build on that. How do you recommend we get that kind of support from these key leaders? And maybe Phil, you can chime in. What messages or what arguments actually do work? What do you need to engage with them and to get them on message?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is you've got to have the positive case of how it benefits the community. And so we've done a lot of work around what are the economic impacts in the community, just educating people on how the community is changing. Because at the end of the day, people have an inherent self-interest in seeing their own community succeed. And so being able to share things like, here's the economic impact. Here are the number of new businesses that have been started by immigrants in our community. Here's the fact that Austin has grown over the last 15 years and is having conversations about how do we get more space in schools and build more housing when our sister community 20 miles down the road is talking about shutting down things and can't get people to come in and fill jobs. So figure out what is their self-interest and talk about how immigration can benefit them and ultimately benefit the community. So it's about building up that positive case.
Yeah, I would add that that for at least in our community's cases, in our case, there were two parts to the communication message. The first part in the early going was just getting elected officials in the community at large up to speed on who these new residents were, and that took a lot of time because when you're starting from zero, it's going to take an enormous effort. So transparency is everything. Any question that came through, whether they were from local residents or people from outside the community, even in some cases outside our state, we would make every effort to try to get back to them to get information. So Jason's point is well taken in that the more, and I think Christina said it too, the harder you work at getting the message out, the harder you work at providing information of any kind, numbers, any data that you can get your hands on, economic impacts, all that stuff. It's all important because it helps address, I think, some of the people, some of the concerns that people might have, particularly when the relocation is new. And in Lewiston's case, it was their first experience with a significant, number of people, from another country coming into their community, and it became a community-wide effort. And that's really the important thing. It wasn't just us getting the information out. There's lots of people and lots of groups.
But does that? Yes, Vicki, go ahead.
Sorry, I might just add that the question seemed to be really framed around what can be done with the local organizations, what can be done with the majority community to convince them to come on board and support immigrants. And I think it's important to remember that while what the panelists have said is true, that takes time. It takes time to become educated. It takes time to understand. It takes time to build coalitions. That as our immigrant populations are growing in our local communities, families and children and community members have needs for services, and in some cases cannot wait for the years that it takes to do that, to depend on that kind of government responsiveness to build. I mean, at the same time that we're having meetings and trying to educate one another, which are all good things, community members are waiting for services and need to get those services.
Yeah, I would only add to what Vicki just said is that we were doing precisely that. You're still meeting the need. You're still doing the services that you need to do. The school is still winding up and trying to get ESL in place and do all the things it needed to do. But at the same time, you're having to address the shortcomings and the policy issues and all of that, all concurrently. You're exactly right. These things are not, in silos. You're doing them all at the same time. You may not be doing them well at first, but you learn quickly.
I want to find out about broader public support. I'm thinking of, just community members, not just leaders, but those long-term residents. And I really want to hear from Jason and Christina, and perhaps from you too, Phil, very briefly, what works? I mean, we know that you need to get that data. You can request fact sheets from our Institute for Immigration Research to find out the local economic impact of the foreign-born. But beyond just the numbers, what else works to build broad public acceptance? Christina?
I was actually going to add, I know we've been talking a lot about getting data, especially like talking about the economic perspective. But I know here in Tulsa, what I think has resonated with a lot of folks is also the idea of how immigrants have become a social fabric, have been part of the social community fabric of Tulsa. So for example, like as I'm talking about immigrants being entrepreneurial in Tulsa, I share about how, everybody goes to the farmers market here locally. There's one very famous farmers market called Cherry Street Farmers Market, and it's like a really nice hip part of town. And if you go to the farmers market, you actually see that the producers of the best vegetables at that farmers market are actually Hmong immigrants. And how if it weren't for our Hmong immigrant community, we would not have had as vibrant of a farmers market as we do now. And there are other examples of how immigrants are actually doing great and impressive things in our communities, not only within our schools, but within our neighborhoods. And so I think it's also important to share the personal side of that. And I think everybody, especially immigrants who have been here for a while, have stories to share about how maybe they were touched by the way that they were welcomed by other groups, maybe the way that they were able to support another family. And so I think that alongside with those data points, which are also very important, it's great to also be able to share personal stories and as Abigail Fisher mentioned, make that meaningful contact.
Make that meaningful contact. It's a lot. It's a lot of these things that people may take for granted, and you really want to flesh them out. Is that right, Jason?
Yeah, I think in Austin, really we found two things works well. One is just being relentless about going out to present and educate, right? And it's facts and it's things like that. I mean, there's no Rotary group in the country that isn't desperately looking for speakers. And so whether it's a church group or a Rotary group or anything, going to where people are. But I think really the bigger insight is this concept of people are self-interested. And so you've got to figure out a way to connect it to how it benefits them in a way that they can relate to. And so perfect example of what we've done a lot is the high school basketball team in our community is huge. So they go to the state tournament, the last person out the door on the way out of town shuts off the lights usually. And so what we do is we start almost every presentation with a picture of our basketball team from 15, 20 years ago, where we were all white and never got past the second round of sections. And then a picture of the most recent basketball teams that are highly diverse and are competing for state titles. And I tell you that even the 75-year-old guy who's been sitting in the gym for 50 years watching this gets that sense of pride about, oh yeah, okay. Now all of a sudden you can put that personal connection to something that they care about that diversity positively impacts, and that really breaks the ice well.
Yeah, I'll share with the panelists that data and research was the most frustrating part of working with this population over the 17 years that I had the opportunity to do so. You have some control over data relative to what you're providing for services at the local level. So, cost, services, some of that information, school information, that kind of demographic information that comes out of that process. But when you need to start diving down deeper into real needs, for instance, labor information, that kind of data simply is not available. It takes an enormous amount of effort. One study was done back in 2008 with the assistance of the State Planning Office in Maine, but that took an enormous amount of effort, that one study. And we haven't replicated that study since 2008. And there's efforts to do that, but answering the question, who's working, where are the needs, what can we be doing better in the state of Maine to focus on how to help this population find work, it's still a very frustrating part of trying to get the job done and meeting the need that's out there.
Well, we're doing this webinar in partnership with a research institute, and I'm interested in knowing Vicki at the state level, Jason at the very local level, what are some of the things that you will need in terms of data? What is missing? Phil talked about the labor market. Can you all expand on what other research needs you all might have?
Yeah, so I come out of the school district, so I'm very familiar with school data. And when I was on the Yakima School Board, we were very interested in what was happening in terms of are schools that served large immigrant communities. And I'm, in my own research, most interested in outcomes. And I find that most of those data are publicly available. So how are kids doing in schools? What is the resource allocation in the municipal level in terms of community parks and community amenities that help with quality of life? Those are often available from publicly available resources and can be broken out by different communities. Often we don't have the individual level data that would tell us is an individual an immigrant or not, but we can look across municipalities, across school districts, and see those areas that are largely impacted by immigrants and their children and identify, are the resources going where they need to go?
And really, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. You know, it's great to have local level data, and, you know, things like the state demographer, at least in Minnesota, is great. You can send up research questions and they'll get back. But, you know, if it's in the congressional district that your city's in, that's fine. If it's something that the state university puts together and it's for the entire state and not just your specific city, that's fine too. And so any data sources that you can find that are tangibly relevant to your community are helpful. It doesn't have to be a specific study done for your community every single time.
And I want to get to some attendee questions in a minute, but I want to make 2 points. One, New American Economy, if you go to their website, they have data going down to the congressional level, as Christina probably knows very, very well, on immigrants' impact, economic impact, particularly as workers, as entrepreneurs. That is a resource that you may want to look to. And before I get to some questions from attendees, I want to ask about law enforcement. And I feel as though, especially in this climate, we want partners with law enforcement in a very, very positive and productive way. Perhaps Vicki, Phil, Christina, what is the best way for law enforcement to be part of this change? How do you create that allyship? Christina, I'm going to start with you.
So I'll share full transparency. We have our city government, and then we also have our county government, and they're completely separate. Our city municipal police force has been pretty open about wanting to work with immigrants, wanting to promote public safety among everyone. However, our county government does have a 287G program that has affected a lot of the trust, a lot of the climate here in Tulsa. And so to say that has been...
and just to be clear, can you just clarify 247G?
287G is a federal contract with ICE to detain immigrants who are undocumented, and so that was definitely a big challenge that we faced as a city as we went through this process. To be completely honest, though, when we did a kickoff summit, we actually did an open invitation, and the sheriff of the county actually decided to attend, which was a big surprise. And honestly, I had no idea how that was going to work out, given that he oversaw that contract. And, the fact that he was there and that he was present throughout all of the conversations, I think was a beginning of a way that we could begin those difficult conversations of, okay, we may be a separate government entity, but your processes, your policies still affect our residents. And not to say that there was like a happy ending with all of this. I mean, it's definitely a part of a relationship building. It's part of a process in which we work together to understand, okay, what are your motivations? What are some of the ways that we could try to meet in the middle and build understanding? I think that also another big issue about safety in general that we've found in our process is the idea of natural disaster preparedness. And so the way that we framed our conversation when it came to law enforcement, we looked at it as a broader public safety issue. And so when we were sharing about our welcoming plan, of course, we did touch on law enforcement issues, but we did talk a lot about the issues of having victims have access to information, how to navigate the law enforcement policies, and then also how can people prepare for a natural disaster?
Phil, do you want to add to that really quickly?
Yeah, because of the size of our city, I think it was it may have been a little bit easier to get to the point where the police department was integrating itself a little bit more effectively at the local level. But still, because it's a small department with not a lot of, not the kinds of resources that, we'd like every department to have, they did a great job in working with their limited resources to not only in the early years begin relationship building with the new residents that were moving into the city, but they actually created a special unit, this community resource unit, which also worked in concert with the community resource officers in the schools. I cannot leave the schools behind in this equation, because they were a critical piece of moving the community dialogue piece along and making those connections. But the law enforcement piece had to work in concert with that. They've done some extraordinary work in relationship building and networking. And when, we recently had an episode that tested the will of the community, I think, a little bit, without going into great detail. But that relationship building and that unit that was created by the police department was a critical piece. And a specific officer, I got to put a shout out to him, Officer Joe Philippon. He's front and center in a lot of this stuff, and it's because of those relationships that a situation that could have really morphed into something more serious, I think, was dealt with very effectively.
You need that input from the leadership. I know in Chelsea, Massachusetts, the most diverse city in all of Massachusetts, the police chief there prints fact sheets on the new immigrant populations for his police force, so they know what the new people look like, what their religions are, what their interests are, what languages they speak. And he himself will tweet to the immigrant community when things happen, so they know that the information is coming from a very credible source, and that they know that that's someone that they can trust. We have some questions about perhaps Vicki and Christina really quickly, because we only have about 3 minutes left. How are your local governments collaborating with immigrant rights and other grassroots organizations? What does that relationship look like? How did that start, and how do you maintain it?
Yeah, I can speak to how that worked in Yakima, at least in the years that I was on the school board. And I have to say that in many cases, there was an attempt to build relationships, but in many cases it was adversarial, because for many years there was a local city council that just wasn't interested in being responsive. And that resulted in a Voting Rights Act lawsuit and a change in local city government. That didn't affect the school board where I was at, because there weren't similar concerns, at least not at the time. But I think it's important to recognize that, yes, we want things to move along in a collaborative way, and we should all be open to that and have that approach. But the fact is that there are communities that are less willing to be responsive, and when that happens, I think it's there are civil rights laws for a reason, and sometimes there have to be changes in government.
I guess at the City of Tulsa, what we've worked towards is always having that relationship open. And so, for example, we have a really awesome Dreamer network here locally that I have personal contact with on a regular basis, at least weekly, and just checking in with them, seeing how they're doing that, but then also having them as part of the leadership throughout any kinds of decision-making process, whether that's helping these immigrant rights leaders as committee chairs, or maybe having them incorporated in events. So we had, in our launch, we had an opportunity to have Dreamers share their story with participants, which I think is a great opportunity for these especially young leaders to build their leadership skills, and also to help improve the end product of policy.
And Jason and Phil, selling this message, I sort of asked this question a little bit earlier. Someone asked, in localities with rapidly growing immigrant populations, the long-term residents can feel like a minority, because all these efforts are for the immigrant population, for the newcomers. And so they may fight any new initiatives just because of how it's framed. What is the best strategy to bring those long-term residents on board? What words do you use? How do you make that inclusive? How do you make that about the community so that it involves them and that they feel it's also for their benefit?
You know, a big portion of it is making sure that when you're talking about immigrants and refugees in the community, that that's not all we're talking about. So we have a lot of focus on, hey, welcoming communities are stronger, and we want everyone in the community to feel like they're a full part of it, whether you've been here for 3 months or you've been here for 70 years. And so just making them feel included in those conversations, and then proactively going out to them to understand what are their questions. And what we found a lot, especially with long-term residents, is it's the unknown. Why are they here? Where are they coming from? How they choose Austin, Minnesota? And I don't know that you're going to get them 100% on board, but at least being able to lower some of that fear factor and create some common bonds and common interests goes a really long way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's well said, Jason. I would echo everything that you just said, and would only add that, you know, I'm familiar with with the Wausau, Wisconsin experience, and I've spoken to them on some occasions. And you know, time. You know, you keep working at it. You never give up. You continue doing the good work that you need to do. Sometimes you think you're just spinning your wheels, but it's important to do it. The outreach, the networking, the failures. You will experience failures in some of the efforts that you launch. But inevitably, they all have value because they constantly make the connections that you need to make as a community to make these things successful. Never feel defeated. Always feel that there's a purpose in the outreach, and ultimately that for every relationship you build, there's value in that. And it's hard work. You know, none of this stuff is easy. It's hard work. We're a much more diverse community too. This started off as a Somali relocation experience. We now have some 30, 40 nationalities now that have taken up residence in our community. It's an extraordinary event. It's what it's morphed into. But at the same time, it's created more work. Now, it is just one culture, one community. It's a very, very broad community. It's exciting, but it's work, and it's worth it, particularly in a state with population growth rate.
So I want to ensure that the point is made that it has to be, one, sustained work, sustained messaging, sustained communications, and two, you need to build as broad an alliance of supporters as possible. I really enjoyed your point, Jason, about it's really a lot of basic education. You think things that people take for granted, other people know, like we did these polls at the beginning of the webinar. There's a lot of misinformation out there, even among those who are working in this field, more so for those long-term residents, more so for those organizations that have not traditionally been reached out with this message. So, Phil, you gave us a very hopeful point to end on. I want to thank everyone for giving so freely of their time, but we'll ask you one last question, which is, given our discussion, what is the one top tip you would recommend for attendees to go out and do right now in maybe 10 seconds? Vicki, we'll start with you.
Engage children of immigrants. Children of immigrants are straddling both cultures and are often a wonderful resource for moving things along.
Phil?
I would say be as transparent as you possibly can. I was contacted by the Denver Post one time about why are we so transparent? Why do we work so hard at it? Because it has value. And the more information you can get out, the less people feel that they're not getting the information, I think the better off you and your community will be.
Christina?
So I guess what I would say to folks who are either working with municipal governments or connected in any way with their chamber, to look into applying to become a Gateways for Growth grant city or community. And also, I know that there's going to be a National Immigrant Integration Conference that's going to be in the beginning of December, and that's a great opportunity to learn more about best practices and what other cities are going.
Or you can join our free webinars and not have to travel anywhere.
Too. Yeah.
And Jason, you get the final word.
The biggest thing is write down what you think success looks like and go from there. There's a tremendous power in having a goal written down, and that clarity of vision will really help as you try to bring stakeholders on board because they know what they're signing up for, and it just has huge power.